Welcome back to my channel. My name is Maresa Talbert. I'm the founder and CEO of Talbert Law Office, your favorite go-to legal resource for all things business, nonprofit, and intellectual property law. As a nonprofit organization, the IRS highly scrutinizes employee pay, especially when that employee is an officer. While the IRS does expect that employees will get paid at market rate, you have to ensure that you do not overpay your employees. Under the IRS standards, they require what's called a reasonable compensation. The bad part is they don't define what reasonable compensation actually is. However, there are some practices that you can follow to mitigate the risk of overpaying an employee and or being penalized by the IRS. All right, so let's jump right into it. When a nonprofit is ready to hire its first employee, or any employee for that matter, you need to conduct an employee compensation survey. With this compensation survey, you need to compare at least 3 to 5, but more if you can, nonprofit organizations' salaries of the same or similar position to the one that you're trying to fill to determine what's reasonable. Now, the comparison to other organizations need to be comparisons between organizations that are similarly situated to yours. And here are some factors that you can use to determine an organization that is similarly situated to yours. You can use factors like the size of the organization, the geographical location of the organization, the required level or experience of the position, the compensation averages in your area or the market rate, the number of hours that will be worked each week or each month, the overall budget of the organization, even the mission of the organization. This is extremely important because a large nonprofit's budget may look very different than a small nonprofit's budget. A national nonprofit may look very different from a local nonprofit. And a reasonable salary is going to be determined based on the totality of these factors. Once you complete that compensation survey, then you can determine what is a reasonable salary for the position that you want to hire. Now we're not done. That was just step one. Now, let's be clear. Compensation, as defined by the IRS, does not only include wages or salary. It includes any commissions, it includes any fringe benefits, any overtime, any bonuses, any little perks. It includes all of that. So your reasonable salary has to include all of those factors as well. Once you come up with a number that you determine is a reasonable salary, then you can move to step two, which is approval by the board. So the board needs to vote on this compensation, and that vote needs to be memorialized in the organization's meeting minutes. Of course, the person whose salary is being considered in that vote cannot participate in the vote. Neither can any person who might be related to that individual. Any person who might benefit from this person's compensation has a conflict of interest and cannot participate in that vote either, such as a family member, a spouse, a daughter, a roommate. Any person who might have a conflict of interest cannot vote in that meeting. Now, once the board has approved compensation, you can then move to drafting the employee agreement, which will outline the employee relationship to include the approved compensation by the board. Now, if you fail to follow these practices, the IRS could determine an excess benefit transaction. Penalties for an excess benefit transaction includes not only fines, but it also subjects your organization to revocation of its tax-exempt status. And if the IRS decides to fine your organization, those fines are held against the board of directors individually, not the organization collectively as a corporation. The IRS sees an excess benefit transaction as private inurement, which is strictly prohibited. Additionally, the person who was overpaid has to pay that money back to the IRS with interest. If that individual fails to repay the IRS by the imposed due date, that individual could face up to 200% excise tax on the amount that is left unpaid. And again, the board members who approve the overpayment are also held to certain fines and excise taxes for approving the overpayment or not preventing the overpayment. Now, the other part of this is that there are also state requirements depending on what state your nonprofit corporation is organized in. For example, when you hire in California, whether it's an independent contractor or an employee, you must register as an employer with the California Employment Development Department. Additionally, depending on your state, when you start to hire employees, you become subject to other expenses such as insurance, workers' comp, payroll taxes, all sorts of things, in addition to the employee's salary. You should also be aware of the classification of your employees, whether they are an exempt employee versus a non-exempt employee. If you are unfamiliar with these terms, let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to do a video to explain them all. But basically what it boils down to is whether your employees are salaried or hourly. The difference in those classifications matter, especially when you are considering overtime pay, rest breaks, lunch periods, and other kinds of employee benefits. The last thing that I will add to this conversation is when you are a nonprofit organization that is starting to hire, you need an employee handbook. An employee handbook goes a long way in providing critical information and your written policies to your employees in a standard way. And when issues arise between you and your employees, it'll keep you out of trouble because you can always refer back to that employee handbook. The takeaway from this video is there are a lot of considerations that you should consider as a nonprofit organization before you start to hire. But beware that the IRS is paying close attention to how much you pay your employees. And the public might be paying attention too. You don't want to lose trust and confidence because you couldn't explain why you're paying your employee as much as you're paying them. Remember, a nonprofit organization is a public entity. It is owned by the public. The public has a right to ask questions. They have a right to scrutinize. They have a right to know. So you want to be able to say that each employee that you've gone through these standard practices and that you know that their compensation is reasonable. Well, that's all I have for today. I hope this video was helpful. Give me your feedback in the comments. As always, this is Talbert Law Office, your favorite go-to legal resource for all things business, nonprofit, and intellectual property law.